Right. Let's have a look at today's module that we're going to discuss. Last week we started off by looking at the demand schedule, the demand graph, and what demand means. And we said that is when your consumer or your client is prepared to pay a specific price for a product and demanding a certain number of items at a specific price. So that was demand, and we said demand has got an inverse relationship to price. So that means the higher the price, the less the demand. The lower the price, the more the demand. I mean, if we think of us as consumers, who doesn't want to buy more of a thing at a lower price? We are prepared to buy more at a lower price, but when things get expensive, then we don't want to pay that much and buy that much of that specific product. Okay, so let's have a look at supply. So now we're going to look at this perspective from the supplier side. So I have a business and I am prepared to supply a number of items at a specific price. So that is what supply is. The quantity of a good or a service that suppliers are willing and able to supply at different levels. And that's our definition. Now, if we look at the law of supply, I'm just going to move you up a little bit there. The law of supply states that when the price of a product increases, the supply of that product will also increase. So here we have to put ourselves in the supplier's shoes. So if I can get 10 Rand for an item, I will supply X number of items. But now, if the price of that product increases and I can now get 12 Rand per item, then I will be willing to supply more to the market because I know I'm going to generate a bigger income. Right, when the price of a product decreases, the supply for that product will also decrease. So if I now all of a sudden only will get 8 Rand per item, then I might not be willing to supply that many items to the market because it's not worth my while. I'm going to lose out in this whole process. So this is very important, and you can see, if you can think back of last week's, how it compares with demand. So with supply, when the price goes up, the supply will also go up. When the price of an item goes down in the market, then usually supply will also decrease. All right. Now the supply graph is a graph showing that the quantity of a good or service that producers are willing and able to supply at different prices. Now, in this case, with the supply graph, we say that there's an intuitive relationship between price and quantity supply, and we say the graph will have a positive slope or slant, and you can see I've indicated there. So if you recall or think back to last week's module on demand, can you see that it's basically the opposite? Where demand, we had, if the price increased, then demand decreased. And when prices decrease, then demand increase. Because the client also always wants to pay as little as possible for an item. Whereas the supplier now on this side obviously wants to get the highest prices for their products, so they are prepared to supply a lot at the high price. Okay, so let's have a look at the supply curve. There's just a little example, and once again we'll have the price on the vertical axis and we'll have the quantity of items on the horizontal axis, and there you can see that our supply curve has a positive slope or slant. Now, if we use the same example from last week, I don't know if you can really see it because I've got a virtual background, but here's my packet of Twiggles chips. You can probably hear it. I haven't eaten it, but now for this example, I am the supplier. So I'm Mrs. Gwen selling these Twiggles in class. So let's have a look at how I will then be willing to supply a certain number of Twiggles chips packets at a specific price. And once again, we have, just as we had the demand schedule, we have a supply schedule. And remember, that's just a table where it indicates at what price will the supplier be willing to supply a number of items. So you can see here, if we look at the price of the Twiggles chips, if I can sell them for R6 in the market, so to the students in my class, then I'll be willing to supply a lot, because I know I can then make a lot of money and a lot of profit. If I can only get R5 for my Twiggles chips, then I might be willing to only supply less, only 20, because that's not really worth my while to only get R5 per packet of chips.
Yes, ma'am.
If the price goes down to R4 in the market for whatever reason, now the chips, I can only sell them for R4. Can you see that I'll only be willing to sell 10 of those packets of chips, because I'm literally not going to make any profit. Okay, so this is our supply schedule. Let's plot this now on a graph. Once again, there's our price in rands, there's our quantity on the x-axis, and we need to use the same increments so that our graph will be in a good relationship. So let's have a look at the first one. If the price is R6, how many will I be willing to supply? 30 of them. So now what do? You go up with your vertical axis, find the R6 and find the quantity, which is 30. So you go across and up and you plot your point on your curve or on your graph. The next one, at R5, I as the supplier am willing to supply 20 packets of chips. So there I go up R5 and I'm willing to supply 20, and where those two lines meet, I make a little dot, and that is then the point on the graph. The last one, at R4, I'm only willing to supply 10 of the packets of chips. So R4, go up on the vertical axis, find the quantity of 10, go up, go across, there's 10, make a point or a bullet, and that is then my information that I've now plotted on the graph. What do I do then? I connect those dots, and that will then be my supply curve. We normally indicate, as with demand, S and S on either side. So can you see that this is now positive? I think I must show it this way if I'm on the video, and compare it then to last week's one, where the demand curve was the opposite. This one is in a straight line, but you can also have one that goes with a little curve like we had here, like this one. It entirely depends on the product and obviously what the supplier is willing to supply. Sometimes we have graphs that go like that they maybe not even in an even curve. That's also perfectly fine. We use the information that's given on the supply schedule, and we basically go and plot those points, and then we connect them with a line. So don't catch a scrick if you sometimes find a curve that's not straight line or a nice neat curve, if I can put it that way. That's also perfectly fine. Okay, yes, now remember when we spoke last week about the law of demand, that if price goes up, demand goes down. If price goes down, demand goes up. And then we said, but this will only be true for if a number of other factors stay the same. Now the same with the supply curve. So let's have a look. For the law of supply to be true, the following must stay the same. Now this means if we look at the law of supply, the only thing that will change is price. And as a result of the change in price in the market, my supply will change as the teacher selling the packets of chips. All these other things must stay the same, or we assume that they stay the same. The moment some of these factors also change, then it will automatically have an effect on the supply and the number of items or products that a supplier is willing to supply into the market. So let's have a look. It's something that these factors can influence supply. First of all, the cost of production. This means the quantity of a good or service that suppliers produce depends on the cost of producing a specific good service. If the good is cheaper to produce, if it costs me as the manufacturer less to produce it, maybe say now I'm producing this packet of chips and for some reason my raw materials become cheaper, then I can actually produce the packet of chips for cheaper, and therefore I'll be able to supply it at a lower price. So then other factors come into play. So if my production cost goes down, it means I might be willing to supply more in the market at a cheaper price. So for our law of supply to be true, we say that the cost of production must stay stable or the same. If the cost of production all of a sudden increases for whatever reason, maybe there was a bad maize crop or drought or whatever, and now all of a sudden my raw material is more expensive, then obviously I might not be willing to supply the same number of items at a specific price. Right, then the method of production. Now, we know that there's constantly technological improvements all around the world. So if, say I have a specific plant that I operate a factory, and now for some reason we come up with new technology or there's new machinery or something we can do to make our method of production more cost effective, then that can also have an influence on my supply to the market. So if there's a technological improvement that enables a greater quantity of the product to produce, then supply of the product might increase. So that can have an effect on my supply to the market. Then the number of producers. If more businesses start to produce the good, then there will be an increase in the supply of the product. If some producers close down, perhaps, then there will be a decrease in the supply of the product. Now, you can just take this example of the face masks that we currently have in our country and all around the world. When it started out and it became a law that people have to wear masks, and with this whole pandemic, there were a few suppliers of face masks in the market, and they were prepared to supply masks at a specific price in the market. But now, like every second post I see on Facebook is about people making face masks, cloth masks, and these wonderful plastic masks and everything. So now there's more suppliers that have entered the market. That can have an effect on the price of the product and also the price at which suppliers are willing to supply masks to the market. So there's so many examples of nice supply and demand scenarios now with COVID-19. I think I'm going to have another lesson just on that. Right, and then the last bit, we've actually touched on that as well, changes in climate. So this most definitely has an effect on the supply of crops. Think what effects extreme drought or flooding will have on the supply of mealie. So for example, like we had with the packet of chips, if we have a very bad year with regards to crops, that can increase the cost of the raw material and obviously the number of items that I will be able to supply to the market at a specific price. And then transport, once again in this time that we are experiencing now, transport is a problem. Depending on how well developed the transport network is that the supplier is using, it can have an effect on the supply. Why do we say so? I have a friend who is importing face masks from overseas. But the problem is there are currently extremely few flights coming into South Africa. It's only cargo flights and they are very limited. The same with ships. It's becoming a little bit easier now with at the ports, but still, due to this pandemic, transport is not that readily available. So now the cost of transport currently is extremely high, and that has an effect on the supply of specific products in the market. Not just face masks, anything that's been imported into South Africa at the moment, the transport cost is extremely high. So once again, if I can just go back, for the law of supply to be true, all of these factors that we looked at must stay the same. Then my supply curve and law will be working out. The moment some of these factors change, then obviously it will also have an effect on the total number of items that I am willing to supply into the market as a supplier. Great, and then homework for you to go check if you can interpret and explain what we have learned today. Is activity 2 there on page 84 in your textbook if you've got that with you, or activity 13 that I've added onto the Google Classroom site that you can also access there. And there's another video from on YouTube that you can watch also on the supply curve and graph, and that also some very nice examples that I found there that you might also find interesting. Right, grade 9, this is basically the discussion on the law of supply, and I hope you found that interesting and that it makes sense. And I think what's very nice is because we've already discussed demand, now supply sort of makes more sense because we have the knowledge of the demand graph and curve from last week. Right.